Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the incredibly complex and honestly fascinating history of opposition within the totalitarian regime of Nazi Germany. If you're gearing up for your IGCSE history exams, or you just want a clear, structured understanding of how people actually pushed back against one of the most oppressive regimes in human history, well, you're in the right place. We're going to look closely at who supported the state, who risked everything to oppose it, and why a massive, widespread resistance never truly materialized.
Here's our agenda for today. First, the totalitarian challenge. Then, youth resistance movements, followed by the church's complicated role. After that, we'll look at military opposition, ask why so little opposition, and finally, we'll be distilling the main learning points.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the totalitarian challenge.
Setting the scene here is absolutely crucial. You have to remember, challenging Hitler's regime was never easy. But by 1939, it shifted from being highly dangerous to being considered outright treason. Germany was at war, which meant any resistance was essentially an act against your own country during wartime. Let's establish some key terminology right off the bat. Widerstand is the German term for resistance. It represents those incredibly brave yet exceptionally rare pockets of opposition. You're dealing with an era of terrifying control. This was a society constantly monitored by the SS, policed by the Gestapo, and governed by terrifying laws like Sippenhaft. Now, Sippenhaft was a brutal policy where your entire family could be severely punished for your individual crimes. Basically, if you stepped out of line, your loved ones paid the price.
To maintain this kind of iron grip, the state had to hijack the future. Hitler ruthlessly targeted the youth for his envisioned thousand-year Reich. The Nazis totally took over school curriculums. Teachers literally had to join the Nazi party or they'd lose their jobs. Science lessons were weaponized to teach that Jewish people were biologically inferior, chillingly referring to them as Untermenschen. History classes relentlessly pushed the Dollstas myth, the false idea that Germany was stabbed in the back during World War I. Hitler's view of children is perfectly captured in his own words. He said, "What material? With them I can make a new world." He viewed an entire generation as nothing more than moldable resources for the state.
Moving on to Section 2. Youth resistance movements.
What's truly fascinating about this era is that despite that intense, inescapable indoctrination we just talked about, some exceptional young people violently and culturally rebelled. There was a huge contrast in how the youth responded. On one hand, boys from age 14 were forced into the compulsory Hitler Youth, which boasted 9 million members by 1938. Girls were pushed into the League of German Maidens to learn the concept of Kinder, Kirche, Küche, meaning children, church, and kitchen. But on the other hand, rebellious factions fought back. You had the Edelweiss Pirates, containing groups like the Roving Dudes of Essen and the Kittelbach Pirates. They completely rejected the Hitler Youth, throwing stones at them and hurling abuse in the streets. One pirate, Barthel Schenk, who was tragically hanged by the Nazis, used a powerful slogan, "Hard are our fist." Alongside them, you had the Swing Youth. They grew their hair long and jitterbugged to jazz, a genre Hitler absolutely despised and called asphalt culture because of its Black American roots.
Now here is a staggering fact. Despite immense pressure, a massive 2 million young people actively avoided joining the supposedly compulsory Hitler Youth. 2 million! That wasn't just a handful of rebels, it was a huge demographic of youth finding ways to slip through the cracks of totalitarianism.
But rebellion carried a terrifying price. Formed in Munich in the summer of 1942, the White Rose student group bravely distributed thousands of anti-Nazi leaflets. It was a peaceful protest, but the consequences were fatal. On February 18, 1943, a caretaker discovered them. Just 4 days later, conspirators, including siblings Hans and Sophie Scholl, were sentenced to death and beheaded. It's a deeply sobering reminder of the regime's sheer brutality and the unimaginably high stakes of even peaceful resistance.
Let's shift gears to Section 3, the church's complicated role.
The response of the Christian churches to the Nazi horrors remains one of the most deeply controversial aspects of this entire era. On the institutional side, the church often chose self-preservation. Back in June 1933, Pope Pius XII, who was nicknamed by some as Hitler's Pope, signed the Concordat. This was an agreement to essentially remain politically neutral towards the Nazis. The church failed to mount a full-scale organizational assault, which historians argue was partly due to inherent anti-Semitism within parts of the institution at the time. Yet, on an individual level, there was incredible defiance. Catholic Bishop Galen vocally criticized the regime, especially calling out the horrifying euthanasia program that targeted people with mental illnesses. Protestant leaders like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Pastor Martin Niemöller also bravely opposed the state. Niemöller actually spent 7 grueling years in a concentration camp for his defiance.
Which brings us to Section 4, Military Opposition.
Now we're looking at the military, a sector where committing treason during wartime quite literally carried the ultimate penalty. Hitler had purged military rivals early on during the Night of the Long Knives to secure his grip, but resistance still brewed within the ranks. One of the most dramatic moments of military resistance was the July bomb plot, famous as Operation Valkyrie. This was orchestrated by a man inside Hitler's own inner circle, Klaus Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg. On July 20th, 1944, Stauffenberg planted a 2.2-pound bomb right at the foot of Hitler's heavy oak desk in the Wolf's Lair. And you know what? It almost worked. But that heavy oak desk ended up shielding Hitler, who only walked away with perforated eardrums. Because the plot failed, the very next day Stauffenberg was executed. He was hanged with piano wire.
The brutal aftermath of Operation Valkyrie was sweeping and horrific. 5,000 people were arrested in the massive crackdown that followed, and 200 individuals were executed. Furthermore, those terrifying Sippenhaft laws we talked about earlier, they were enacted against their families, punishing completely innocent relatives for the treason of the conspirators.
While we're exploring Widerstand, we definitely have to remember extraordinary acts of military bravery beyond Germany's borders too. Take the incredible story of Witold Pilecki. He was a Polish soldier who did the unthinkable. He voluntarily and deliberately got himself sent to the Auschwitz death camp. His mission? To gather intelligence, organize resistance from the inside, and eventually break out to reveal the true, unimaginable horrors of the Holocaust to the outside world. It is honestly one of the most astonishing acts of courage in human history.
Okay, Section 5, Why So Little Opposition?
Having highlighted these absolute shining beacons of humanity across the youth, the church, and the military, we have to face the overarching historical question. If this bravery existed, why was this opposition the exception rather than the rule? Why wasn't there a mass uprising? To understand this, historian Detlef Peukert provides a really effective structured model. He breaks resistance into steps. Step 1 is low-level resistance. We're talking about things like grumbling about the price of bread or telling anti-Nazi jokes in secret. It was common, sure, but it rarely threatened the state. Step 2 is high-level resistance, active plotting and sabotage. Because it carried massive, life-ending risks, this high-level resistance was incredibly rare. But it was the only type that actually stood a real chance of impacting the regime.
When we look at the broader societal picture, it reveals a deeply nuanced structural puzzle. The lack of mass high-level resistance wasn't just some historical mystery. Rather, it was the result of a highly calculated web of overlapping social and political factors, all designed to keep the population completely compliant.
The masses were kept in check by two main forces working in tandem: control and fear, countered by satisfaction and manipulation. Let's break that down. First, people were terrified. The SS and Gestapo were everywhere. Furthermore, political opposition was deeply divided. Communists and Social Democrats distrusted each other so much they only met in small, whispering campaigns. Plus, the Nazis had legally dismantled almost all organized opposition anyway. But, and this is crucial, it wasn't just fear. Many Germans actually liked Hitler's early foreign policy and really desired the stability he brought after years of chaos. Effective censorship bred ignorance, meaning many simply didn't know the full extent of the atrocities being committed. And the Nazis were smart. They knew when to compromise. For example, they temporarily halted the euthanasia program when church leaders sparked public outrage, and they kept policies toward Jewish citizens heavily secret to avoid mass unrest.
Finally, Section 6, Distilling Main Learning Points. To make sure you are perfectly primed with your IGCSE knowledge, let's metaphorically distill this entire explainer down to its absolute essential elements. What are the concentrated drops of knowledge you absolutely need to take away from this?
Here are your 3 essential distilled learning points. Number 1, the sheer scale of totalitarian control, combined with wartime conditions, made open resistance effectively treasonous, incredibly dangerous, and therefore very rare. Number 2, despite this danger, exceptional Widerstand absolutely existed, whether it was the White Rose Youth, brave individual church leaders, or the military plotting of Operation Valkyrie. And number 3, widespread mass opposition failed because the regime utilized a potent mix of Gestapo terror, deeply divided its political opponents, controlled information through intense propaganda, and strategically kept enough of the public satisfied with minor compromises and early foreign policy wins.
I want to leave you with the powerful final words of Sophie Scholl. She spoke these bravely at her trial, right before she was executed for simply handing out leaflets. She said, "Somebody had to make a start.
It's a profound historical reminder for all of us. Even when an entire system is meticulously designed through terror and manipulation to silence you, why is it so vital that someone, somewhere, decides to make a start? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you next time.